Hey, welcome back to another week, another edition of Curiosity, Not Judgment. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
And as you can tell, we are removed again. You are a few states away, but we were able to carve out a little bit of time to connect today and to have some really good conversation. And so last week we had talked about, are you considering the end user in mind when you're creating a plan or when you're crafting a design or building something? And we are going to continue this conversation with a slightly different flavor. And where I want to go today is that concept of pride or pivot. Because if you've gone to the extent of inquiring of the end user about what would be most beneficial to them, what's going to be most helpful in, how you can craft a plan, a design, etc., and they say something that's contrary to your original thought or your design, are you going to stay rooted in pride and push forward with your idea, your notion, or are you going to be willing to pivot? And it is a hard moment to make that determination sometimes.
And it has consequences. If
Sure.
you've gone way down the road on a prototype for a product, for instance, and then you get new customer input,
Mhm.
either through your internal folks or externally, you have to make a decision. Is it worth the engineering change order? Is it worth the extra time and effort to redo or pivot? Hopefully, it's not a major throw everything away you've done and start over, but it's going to be at least a pivot. It's going to be something, okay, is this a form factor? Is this a software? Is this a design? Is this a user interface? How hard is it on the scales
Mhm.
to pivot to this new information? Or do you just give up that segment of the population that wants that?
Mm.
Which is, an interesting thought process also.
Certainly. You know what comes to mind is a movie scene from the Christmas movie Elf, where the dad, who's the book publisher, comes to light that two of the pages were missing
Yes.
in the print run. And, his explanation is like, well, who cares? They're kids, they'll never notice. It's that pride moment of not being willing to step back or not willing to count the or to take the cost, the hit of, your income of your revenue because of the need to pivot. And so sticking in that pride position, pushing something out that's incomplete, inaccurate, or simply doesn't meet the need of the customer. So it does involve a cost, as you said.
And this person skipped the 2 to 3 year old. I know the movie reference you're talking about, and he has a kid, but he must have skipped the 2 to 3 year old part of reading books to
Mhm.
kids because they memorize and they know everything. And you will be reading a book over and over and over again if it's one of their favorites. And I think they'd notice. But it's funny. It's a supreme lack of consideration
Mm.
of the customer, and not only not knowing the customer, realizing that you've made a boo-boo
Yeah.
and not willing to fix it. And so, I mean, the ultimate of pride.
Yeah. Well, and I think this can play out in so many different situations, right? Maybe you're preparing a meal for somebody that's coming over, you've planned, you've shopped, you're getting ready to make this, something specific that you've had, and then you find out there's a food allergy and this contains, something that the people can't eat. So you have to swallow your pride. You can't serve a meal that's dangerous to somebody. You've got to step back, you've got to, reshop, replan, do all of the things. But man, is that painful sometimes when you're crunched on time, crunched on budget. And so, yeah, I think these are curious questions we have to ask ourselves in some of these moments. You've got the extreme of manufacturing a product, and you've got some probably smaller ways that this might play out in your everyday life. But we have to stop and ask that curious question. Am I going to stay rooted in my pride and push forward with my agenda, or am I willing to pivot?
We as individuals and as companies have a brand, and you want your brand to be one that is responsive to your customers' needs. In general, if you're concerned about being there for the long term, and if you want that brand, I suppose you could ignore that, and people have in the past and pay the price. And but what you bring up is a great example of there are prioritizations
Mhm.
of these pivots. You bring up one that you almost have to do.
Yeah.
You could, it's, somebody's life is literally at stake. But that's the extreme, right? There's a continuum, and there are some that it's not worth making the pivot.
Mhm.
You're gonna respond to this customer input, and it's gonna gain you 10 customers. out of 10,000. Well, then it may not be worth it. But
Right.
that evaluation and that thoughtful consideration is the key. And should I pivot? Should I do this based on new information? In the book, The Lean Startup, and this is classic. I work very closely with National Lab, and it's legendary that a very smart PhD will, principal investigator at a national lab will come up with something that they think should be commercialized because they think everybody should have it. And I will tell you that in my experience, 100% of the time, the actual commercialized product, if it's successful, is a pivot from
Mm,
the original idea. 100% of the time, in my experience, for a successful commercialization. But every step along the way, that PhD, very smart person has to swallow a bit of pride and
mhm,
say, you know what? I believe this is what the customers will need and will pay for, but based on customer input. So in the book, The Lean Startup, Eric Ries says you need to take your idea and go ask 100 customers,
mm,
not one, not 10, 100. And you literally go find people that you think are your target audience, and you ask them, does this solve a pain? How much would you pay for it?
mhm.
How hard is it to get into your life? How
Yeah.
big can it be? All the questions, because you may have the perfect product, but it's too expensive.
Mhm,
Or you may have, and now you have to think about early adopters versus the laggards and that whole S curve and all that. But can you get those first ones out and sold, right? Is the price too, is the form factor too big?
mhm,
Yes, I need this. It's going to solve this pain, but I can't fit it through my front door, right?
mm,
So it's all of the things together and really figuring out what is it that your customer actually wants. Now we're using a customer thing here. You had a really good example about a meal. But we are doing this all the time in our lives. We are going from disengaged. We don't care about something because it's not hitting us yet. It's not today. It's not a deadline. It's not something I've cared about in the past. You have an idea. You have a catalyst that says, I need to be engaged. We want to move to discernment. How do we do that in a way that gets us the right thing for the other people?
mhm. When I think about somebody's willingness to pivot or somebody's in unwillingness to pivot, I feel like that's kind of this rigidity versus this flexible personality, really in thought process and in just willing to consider maybe there's something better, even though my original idea, my original plan isn't going to work. I think the personality type and the willingness to consider like maybe this is going to lead to something good rather than being so angry and so frustrated that you just stop altogether the thing that you're working on. So it's that rigidity versus that willingness to pivot. And I think about the story about the guy who invented the post-it note, right? That was never his intention. It was
No,
never looking to invent a post-it note. He was in a lab and he was tasked with developing this ultra sticky glue. Well, as anyone who has used a post-it note knows, that is far from an ultra sticky glue, right? It is an adhesive that instantly pulls right back off as soon as you apply any pressure. But his willingness to not be kind of just like angry and frustrated and throw up his hands and say, fine, if my formula is not going to work, I just quit the whole thing. He was willing to pivot and consider like, okay, my formula, my scientific know-how didn't pan out in the way that I was slated to, do this thing. However, I think there's maybe some different application for this mess up, and it was curiosity, I think, and that willingness to pivot that probably led to him being a millionaire by the end of his life. I don't actually know the money part of it, but
No, you're right. And the pivots continued in that story, by the way. He
oh,
went to
tell me.
his bosses and management and said, look, I think I've got something here that might be useful, in an everyday life office situation. And they said, nah, we're not buying it. And so what he did, as the story goes, and I wasn't there, but this is how I've heard it reported, is What he did was he produced some in prototype mode and went and gave it to all of the admins in the building.
Mm.
The admins started using them and they started showing up on documents for the decision makers. And then eventually they said, okay, we get it. This might be a winner. Let's go.
Well, so he engaged his 100 customers, right, to see if this was a useful product and how they would use it. And that ended up maybe turning the mindset of the top bosses to have this be a marketable product.
That's right. That's right. And this is the key, right? And
Yeah.
I think it was Zig Ziglar used to say, you can get anything you want as long as you help enough other people get what they want. And so
Mm,
if you stay focused on what do they really want, what do they really need, how do you really solve their pain, and less focused on your own self, thinking I've got the idea,
mhm,
you know, and this goes even if you've got a product that you've already established and it's not going to change. You still need to listen to your customers and figure out their pain to figure out how they might utilize your product, which might be a totally different way
mhm.
than you had first envisioned.
Yeah. I think of another story, and again, like these are just popping into my head right now, so I don't have them in front of me to get all of the details correct, but about the lifesaver candy, right? That was birthed out of a tragedy that happened, a child sucking on a hard candy that got lodged in the airway. And then, as I've heard the story, the inventor of the lifesaver candy went on to say, well, I'm going to create a candy with a hole so that if that candy were to get lodged in the throat of a child, there would still be airflow. And so, yeah, sometimes we have something that we've thought through, we've executed on, maybe it's even a product that's gone to market, and then something terrible happens. It hurts somebody, it kills somebody, it causes a situation that you could have never foreseen. And so then again, you have that pride versus pivot question. You could hang your head in shame, leave the marketplace altogether, just sit in that place where you're going to be just condemned over and over and over again in your own mind, or you can kind of pick yourself up, not ignoring the bad things that have happened, but pivoting and making a difference because of them.
And this is the key. And so it goes back to that. I love what you're saying there, pride versus pivot. Does my pride get in the way of pivoting? And this happens think about any mental model, anything that you've built, a set of assumptions that you walk into a room and then all of a sudden you get a different result. That's a good time to take a step back and think, wait a minute. My mental model of this, my paradigm of this situation didn't get me the outcome I needed or wanted. And so therefore, what am I missing? What part of this, what new data do I need? What is missing from my current mental model that I could bring in to improve it so that next time it would be successful?
But that really goes to the heart of the matter, which is a curiosity mindset, because
Mhm.
I think there is a temptation to just shut down. My pride has been wounded, my thing didn't go, whatever that thing is. And so I give up. I withdraw, I'm done. Or the curious question is, okay, that iteration didn't work, but there are some things that perhaps could be altered. And based on the feedback I'm receiving, I'm still feeling like this is a viable option to move forward. How can I make this better? And those are all those curious questions that begin to kind of percolate and get somebody who's really inventive and somebody who's has that natural inquisitive spirit about them from staying in that place of stuck or, shame or pride.
One of the things that's fascinating to me is that the inventor's dilemma and and which of the ideas, because we all have ideas, and sometimes I'll see something out in the market and go, I thought of that a couple of years ago, but
Mhm.
I never executed, right? So once you go through the pain of executing, it's almost like childbirth and you've got your baby. The
Mhm.
more you associate your own self-worth
Mm.
and your own ability to succeed with one thing that you've created, the harder it is sometimes to pivot because you're saying, Virga, that this thing that I birthed that is me is needs a pivot. That means that there's something wrong with me. And
Mm.
if we can dissociate ourselves from our ideas, then we'd be far less defensive and apt to be subject to that pride of not taking in new data and pivoting.
That's huge what you're saying. I mean, I hope people can pause for a moment and really consider, for all of us in our own lives, when we have these moments, and we're gonna have these moments about, am I gonna so associate this end product with my self-worth, my value, my intelligence, my everything, that I'm gonna get stuck there, or am I willing to take a breath, step back, and willing to pivot based on the new data that's come in? Because I can think of so many applications to what you just said. And, we shared from the very beginning that you and I are in this process of trying to write a book. And while we've not gotten to that stage yet, I could imagine if we, get all of this recorded and documented, and let's say we've got 200 pages that are sent off to a publisher, and the publisher says, yeah, there's something in there, but you're not hitting the mark, right? Like, it would be easy to say, well, forget it. We've poured years into this, both through the podcast, through our research, then ultimately through getting stuff on paper. We've poured years into this. And if they're saying it's not right, that's all of who we are. And so forget it. I guess this is just a waste of time, or you ask the curious questions. Okay, well, what pivot could we make? And are we thinking maybe atypical from the population who would read this book, etc. And how can we then get out of pride, do the pivot, and then produce something different?
And I think we've talked about this before. My sister is a writer, and I can almost guarantee that that process you just said is going to happen, where
Yep.
we'll send it off to somebody who is a producer who knows the market much better than we do. We'll say, yeah, there's something there, but you're going to have to pivot and you're going to need to do this. And it may even be changing the style, which is the most personal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it might be something more significant or less significant. And if we're willing to do that, then we may have success. If we are not willing to, I would predict that it would never get published.
Mm-hmm. But that concept of it, whatever the it is who I am. Like, if it's tone of voice or style, and you've invested so much of your heart and your mind into producing this thing, and to be told, no, it's not right, for us to kind of divorce the thought process from that's a reflection on me and my character and my intelligence. That's a tough place, but it's a critical place. And that's really, I think, where those hardcore curious questions have to come in.
They really do. I'm reading a book right now called "Surrounded by Idiots," and it's a fun one. It's taking the disc profile and doing it in a new way, and people are either red, yellow, blue, or green, and it's another way to try to navigate this world with the different personalities that we kind of fall into. And like any of these, it's not meant to pigeonhole people. It's just meant for us to figure out why everybody around us doesn't respond the way we want them to. And whenever we have our brilliant ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
But part of the brilliant idea is the delivery. Part of the brilliant idea is how well it can be articulated to others. Part of the brilliant idea is how much of a pain or interest does the receiver have in this at this season in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you take that rejection as a rejection of the idea out of hand, that's a bad thing. But it's even worse if you take the rejection as I'm bad.
Right.
I'm no good. I'm not capable of producing something good, right? There's different levels of rejection.
Sure.
And as I said before, if you can dissociate yourself from your idea, just put the idea out there. And then with everybody else, objectively look at it and say, is this a good thing or a bad thing? And poke your own holes in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the healthiest way to do it, because then you're much less likely to get into the defensiveness and the pride of not pivoting and defending something that may have no defense.
Yeah. And I think one of the ways to help mitigate getting to that space is to be including feedback through the whole process, right? If you're one of those hunker down, get it done kind of a people, and you're in your box and you're working on something for a year or 2 years or 3 years and are never having any external input, then it's even more difficult, I would imagine, to disassociate yourself from the end product. Because if ultimately you produce it and somebody says, yeah, that's not right, or it's not gonna be saleable or whatever, not marketable, then it's so much more difficult. But if you along the way have been getting input like, hey, let me show you version 1 of this thing, or let me have you read this manuscript, or have you whatever, would love your feedback. And again, we talked about this maybe more than a year ago about having people in your life that are willing to be honest in the feedback that they give you, not just yes men, right? You don't want everybody in your life to say, oh, you're so brilliant, that's great, it's a perfect thing, and couldn't be any better, right? You want people to say, this kind of misses the mark right here, or I think I see where you're going, but there needs to be some clarification, right? We need that type of feedback along the way so that if ultimately a pivot needs to happen at the end, it's not nearly as painful.
Absolutely. And we're talking in terms of kind of like product and long life cycle type ideas here. But this happens every time you throw out an idea at work or in a social setting. And if you feel like you're rejected every time you throw out an idea, that gets to be a problem.
Yes.
Is it the idea or is it me? Do they not like me? Right. And those kinds of thoughts are not usually useful. And so it's really important to say to just again be able to throw ideas out there. And by the way, if you have any influence on the culture of your business at all, and we all do to some extent,
Hmm.
make sure that people's ideas are heard.
Hmm.
And then for whatever reason, make sure that if you reject that idea, you're not rejecting them.
Yes.
You're saying what about these attributes are good and what about are bad? Or can you hopefully take a kernel of that and
Hmm.
say, yes, and
Yeah.
we could do this, 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 and this, and then that would make that really good. And then as the recipient of that, you say, okay, wasn't my original idea, but I like the way this is going. Let's investigate this a little bit. Let's stay curious. Let's stay in dialogue.
Yeah.
And then as a group, that's the best way to get the different folks together to produce something that a lot of people will like, as opposed to just one segment will like.
Yeah. I like it. All right. Well, those curious questions just keep stacking up that we can ask ourselves and ask of our world around us, right? Am I going to stay in a place of pride? Am I willing to pivot? And everything from the micro decisions that you have throughout the day to the big guys that are taking years to execute. But I think we can just stay curious through the journey. So, Gary, thank you so much.
All right, you take care.
You too, and we'll see you back in town soon.
Yes, next week.